Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the next session of LitFestx. We have with us Ms. Ananya Vajpeyi, a well-known scholar, fellow with the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in New Delhi. Ananya is well known for her research interests in intellectual history and political theory, and she's also authored quite a few books in the past. The book that we are discussing today is Righteous Republic. The interesting fact, for our viewers is that Ananya stays in New Delhi. She lives there. She works at the CSDS. She's currently traveling to Istanbul, where she's in conversation with us. I am in Mumbai, and this session is being broadcast live on YouTube globally. I think, Ananya, we couldn't have asked for a more global virtual feel to the festival that you have brought with a book on India, anchored in Delhi, being spoken of between Mumbai and Istanbul.
Yeah, it just so happens, this is the world today.
Right.
Yeah.
So, Ananya, diving straight into it, tell us a little bit about the context of a righteous republic and India.
Well, my book is about the coming into being of the Indian Republic. So it's basically set in it's a history of ideas, and it's set sort of between the late 19th century leading up to independence and the making of the Indian Constitution. So it stops around 1950 or late 1950s, when the last person featured in the book, Ambedkar, dies in 1956. So it's kind of set in the nationalist and anti-colonial era. And I look at sort of important figures in the nationalist movement, sort of the founding fathers, if you like, of the Indian Republic. I look at 5 people specifically: Gandhi, Ambedkar, Nehru, Rabindranath Tagore, and the painter Abanindranath Tagore. So 2 Tagores, basically. And I look at how, what kinds of histories, what kind of texts, what kinds of ideas, what kinds of philosophical resources they draw on to try to imagine a future for India, and a future of political independence, a future as a new kind of political entity, not a British colony, not a country that's basically not a free country, right? So as they are struggling against British rule, and they're trying to come up with what India will look like if it becomes politically independent, if it attains Swaraj, what longer histories of political ideas and philosophical ideas are they drawing on to help to create this, what I call the righteous republic, because they're trying to imagine something, that's not a colony, that's not colonized by the British Empire, that's some other kind of nation state. And what will that look like? Who will it include? Who will it empower? What is the actual meaning of a term like Swaraj, which is defining the political struggle throughout this period, throughout the first half of the 20th century in India? So in that sense, that's what I meant by righteous republic, is the thing that they're struggling to make, and that comes into being to some extent, in some way, howsoever partial, around the moment of independence.
And do you think the distance, or the difference rather, between what you would say is the real righteous republic and India, do you think that is shrinking, or is it too far apart?
Well, I mean, you have to grant that the fact that from being this sort of colonized, sort of jewel in the crown of the British Raj, India went overnight to becoming the world's largest democracy. And, we were able to get universal adult franchise, electoral democracy, equality for men and women, for people of all castes and, religions, and, the genders, and different regional sort of identities. The fact that, there was that genuine creation of something new, going from colony to democracy like that, and creating equal citizenship right from the get-go. And then, of course, coming up with this great egalitarian liberal constitution that was really committed to social justice and to bringing equality to a very, very unequal society. Those were great achievements. And, over the decades, I think, to varying extents, various promises that are in the Constitution, or that were made, at that moment, at that heady moment of partition and independence, those have been realized to a large extent. India has moved out of the kind of poverty it was in at that time. More and more people have entered into the democratic process. There's a robust political life. There are strong institutions, although they may go through periods of crisis and churning. But, basically the judiciary, and other kinds of institutions of governance, the economy, everything has grown, and everything is continuing to grow and expand. And more people are being brought into the conversation, right? Including now with the sheer kind of numerical growth in the middle classes, and in their quality of life, and in their various kinds of indices. But on the other hand, the population has also grown insanely from the time of independence, and in many ways inequalities are also growing between the haves and the have-nots, or new kinds of inequality are appearing, which were not imagined by the kind of founding fathers. For example, they put in a system of reservations or positive discrimination very early on for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. But really, both Ambedkar and Nehru imagined that, this would only be necessary for about 10 years. And after that, everybody would have caught up, and different communities and different groups would be on the same level playing field. And then we could sort of move into a phase of genuine equality and equitable development. But as you know, that has not happened. In fact, we have more and more reservations. We have, we need to include more communities into the ambit of positive discrimination, because the state has to look out for so many new kinds of discrimination and inequality that have appeared as a result of globalization. So I think, as long as the Constitution stands, and as long as the Constitution continues to be the kind of document that defines what India is and where it's headed, and it provides the kind of fundamental direction, I think we are on track. It's only when we start deviating from the sort of fundamental principles on which this nation was created, that's when you really need to be worried. And that can happen with large-scale political change, as we've seen just in the last few years. That either if you have elected governments that are not delivering, or that are racked by corruption, or that have other kinds of institutional problems, right? Or you have elected governments that are majoritarian and are moving away from the basic idea of a secular, liberal, democratic republic towards some other kind of polity. Then that really goes to the heart of, can India retain its found, the identity that it had at the moment of the foundation, which was put together with great difficulty and great struggle, and which had a big promise to, one of the world's largest populations.
Right. No, that's very interesting. You mentioned that. You know, uh, so since this book was out about 2 years ago,
Three
uh,
years, yeah.
3 years, what were your views then about India actually being a righteous republic or being close to it compared to, let's say, now? I mean, where do you see us today vis-a-vis when you wrote the book?
I mean, I started writing this book in 2007,
Wow.
and we are now in 2015, and lots of things have changed in this time. So the book is a history. It was never meant to be a description of the present. It doesn't allude to the present.
Sure.
Obviously, I am writing it in the present time because I'm the author, and I'm looking back on a moment in history which was 50 or 60 or 100 years ago. But the title was never meant to describe a real country like contemporary India. It was meant to point to the kinds of ideals, the aspirations, the norms, the values, the vision, the political vision, which I felt could be seen, through the through the political and intellectual work that was done by so many of the sort of founding figures, right? Many of whom were not just mass leaders; they were also, public intellectuals. They were also scholars. They were also thinkers and writers. So people like Gandhi, people like Ambedkar, even somebody like Nehru. I mean, it's not just that they had mass following, and they were involved in political and historical events. They were also people who were deeply engaged with ideas, and who were learning from the rest of the world around them, who were learning from the past, who were connected to different communities all across India and in other parts of, the world. So, the righteous republic I was trying to capture the idea, or the set of ideas, or the body of ideas, sometimes even contradictory ideas, which they were trying to realize in time, in historical time. And how those ideas have fared is something which is a different story. That's not the story that I'm telling in my book. um, but as far as your question, I mean, definitely 2012 was, quite a different moment just in terms of contemporary politics in India. Um, and subsequently after that, I mean, so many things have happened. The discussion on women's rights, on sexual harassment, on violence against women in the workplace, the new laws dealing with rape and sexual harassment. I mean, that's been one big theme that, I also moved to India just around the time, just before the book was coming out. I had been living in the United States for many years before that. So right around when I moved back and the book came out, one of the big conversations that was happening in Indian public life was, following on the gang rape in Delhi on December 16. And then subsequently, of course, there was an election, and there were all these sort of corruption scandals in the previous government, and the lead up to the election, and the election of a new government, the formation of this new BJP-led government, and then everything which has happened since then, which really goes to the heart of many of the values that are enshrined in the Constitution, which have to do with civil liberties, which have to do with freedom of expression, which have to do with the relationship between different communities, whether it's Hindus and Muslims, minorities and majorities, different caste groups. I mean, in some sense, those foundations are really being shaken at the moment, I think. And it's something which is, deeply worrying. And I think, many of us in academia, in journalism, those of us who are involved in the media or in institutions of higher learning and research, I mean, these are things which have concerned many of us. Not just as citizens, but also as people who professionally or as experts deal in this kind of thing. So I think, I mean, the book was really meant as a history, but it has become, it has had a very lively reception, and many people have written about it, both positively and critically. Many people have invited me to speak, to engage with them, and the book has um, been at the center of many conversations, I think, because of the way it resonates with or against what is actually happening in real time. I mean, all around you, you see this republic sort of falling apart. And so, everybody is interested to remember, where we started this journey, and what the actual hopes were, and what somebody like Gandhi or Ambedkar had to say about what India should be like, and comparing that to what it has become, or where it could be going. Um, so in that sense, the book is, I mean, it was never meant to be about the present. It was never a contemporary book, but it has, I mean, my experience in the last 3 years is that it has been in discussion because of, um, what it provides as a kind of mirror held up,
Absolutely.
to the present.
You spoke of some of the uh, possibly contradictory ideas which
Yeah,
the founding fathers of the nation were dealing with in
yeah,
an effort in nation building. Give
yeah.
a couple of examples there.
Well, I think the biggest crack in the foundations is that, Gandhi was a believer in nonviolence, and ahimsa was central to his theory of good politics, and of the way in which Swaraj could be achieved was through ahimsa, through satyagrah, and through nonviolent politics. And yet, right from the get-go, I mean, we had this violent and bloody partition through which India and Pakistan actually became free countries, right? So right away, right, you see that for the previous 30, 40 years, Gandhi had been talking about ahimsa, and he was the face of the national movement. I mean, he is the father of the nation. But the very birth of both nations, of India and Pakistan, was so violent, right, and involved so much displacement and death and disruption on all sides. So that's one contradiction right there. uh, you know, then Gandhi himself was assassinated, right? But he was assassinated by, essentially the Hindu right. Now, the Hindu nationalists basically were also in the conversation during the nationalist period, from at least the 1920s. The RSS was founded in 1925, and they never really, and the Hindu Mahasabha was very much a part of the conversation, but they never, became the mainstream of the nationalist struggle. They attracted a lot of followers, but it was really Congress-led nationalism that carried the day, right? And further, by going out and killing Gandhi in 1948, I mean, I think they really put themselves out of business for decades. So it has taken them practically, the rest of their lives to come back to the table as a viable conversation partner. Now, had Hindu nationalism and Hindutva been, you know, a big force, right? Then right there you see the contradiction between a kind of secular liberal vision that people like Nehru and Tagore had, and Gandhi, of course, and a Hindu nationalist vision. So India could have, been a very different kind of country had the Hindu nationalists carried the day in that time, whereas in fact the Congress carried the day, right? Then you also see a sort of contradiction developing, right from the early part of the 20th century, where initially a lot of people who later on became Muslim League leadership were actually Congress leaders, right? They were part of the same kind of front against British rule, and they were part of the same conversation, looking to, possible independence for India, right? It's only by the 1940s that you suddenly see the strong emergence of this demand for, two nations, or the idea that there could be a separate Muslim homeland, right, to which many people were willing to subscribe and many people were willing to give their lives. This is something which entered into the conversation really late in the game. Like, we are almost at independence after, Second World War, 1945-46, and it's still not clear that, we're definitely heading into partition, right? So these tensions, I mean, they're not part of the story from the get-go. If you start looking from the 1880s, you can't really predict that ultimately you'll end up with India and Pakistan, right? Or that it'll come about in such a violent way. But as things and as different personalities come to clash with one another, you have unpredictable outcomes. Another really great example is the kind of differences that developed slowly between Gandhi and Ambedkar, right, from the 1930s onwards, from the Pune Pact, where Ambedkar really wants the conversation on the rights of untouchables to be as important and as central. So he's talking about social equality and doing away with the caste system within Hindu and Indian society. He's saying that we need independence from caste inequality as much as we need it from British Raj, right?
Sure.
Both things are as key to a really truly independent India. You can't just say, oh, we'll deal with caste later, and first let's look at political independence. So Ambedkar was always thinking in that way, and the Congress and Gandhi had different priorities, in the sense that first they wanted to be done with British rule, and then they would talk about social reform. So you see a kind of contradiction between what Ambedkar calls a political revolution, right? And the political revolution kind of takes precedence. And we are still, 6-7 decades later, we haven't succeeded in a social transformation where you have genuine equality for the most vulnerable and the most backward communities.
Right. Ananya, I must say some very, very interesting, parallels that you've drawn in terms of the contradictions in those times and even before that. Um, you know, we obviously are not the righteous republic yet. I mean, there's so much of inequality. I think the recent report on the inequality index was, I think, that 1% of the Indian population, the top 1%, owns, I think, 53 or some obscure percentage of that sort of the wealth of the country. And I think the bottom poor are pretty much fighting over just 10% of the total wealth of the nation. So, where do you see? I mean, is the idea of, for instance, let's not refer to the book, but just to the idea of a righteous republic. Do you think it is more really this utopic, ambition that a republic like India can have to be, landing up somewhere, or do you think we are just all misplaced right now?
No, I think, look, political struggle and revolutionary political struggle is driven by a kind of a set of utopian ideals, right?
Sure.
I mean, utopia literally means no place, right? So it's the opposite of a real place. There's no place, right? It's just an abstraction. It's a set of visions and dreams and ideals which you're trying to kind of find your way. And even, these 5 people that I look at, you could, from some perspective, they're all on one side. But even between them, there are actually great differences. For example, how Gandhi feels about technology is not at all how Tagore feels about technology. How Nehru feels about modern industrial economy is not at all what Gandhi had in mind with his handicrafts and his village republics and so on. So even there, or of course, between Ambedkar and Gandhi, there were great differences on the question of social justice. So, in a sense, you can't really, you can't pin, you can't make a map and say this is the righteous republic with exactly these contours, with exactly this shape, with exactly, filled with a particular set of ideas. It's a changing, it's a shifting goalpost, right? It's always out there on the horizon, and you may or may not reach it, and that's fine. I mean, that's the nature of politics, and that's the nature of an evolving, living, entity, like a large collective of people, like a nation. But I think, I mean, there needs to be, right, and given the diversity, given that India is the world's most diverse country, and given that you have all kinds of different starting points for different groups and different communities, different ideas, different histories of where they're coming from, where they're trying to get. There has to at all times be the possibility of remaining in conversation, and of there being a robust public sphere and open, debate, and a political process that is essentially inclusive and empowering. There has to be that for even for you to disagree in a coherent way, or in a productive way, right? Even to sort out those differences, you need a certain openness, and you need for that dialogue to continue, right? You cannot be shutting down spaces, cannot be silencing voices, you cannot be clamping down on dissent or disagreement.
Certainly.
Because if everyone is not part of it, then it's not a conversation, it's a monologue, right? And that's the opposite of democracy. I mean, democracy has to be noisy, and it has to have lots and lots of voices, and different people will say different things, it's inevitable. But that that only becomes a problem if you have an authoritarian tendency.
Sure.
As in the kind of powers that be, in the ruling class, or in the elected government. Otherwise, it's a question of managing differences while trying to maintain some kind of forward momentum, where ultimately we can all agree that, listen, the idea is to get more people out of poverty, right? The idea is, for women not to be horribly oppressed. The idea is for people to realize their potential and to flourish. And the idea is to contain and curtail terrible violence. And right now, I'm not sure that we are doing too well, at least on some of these fronts.
Sure. Right. So speaking of conversations, we've got, a stream of some questions for you from the online audience. I know we're running out of time, so I'm just going to, pick one. I'm going to show the question right now on the screen, and you can read it and respond to it. Just give me a second there.
Okay.
Can
I'm not seeing. Oh, I see. Okay.
Can you see it?
Yeah, I can. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm reading it out for the listeners. How widely do you think India knows India as it was seen and anticipated by its founders?
I have discovered after writing this book that a lot of people are entirely familiar. I mean, they may not know some historical details here or there, but nothing I've written really came as a surprise. So people on the whole are, people who are reading this book or talking about it are pretty well acquainted with a kind of basic set of ideas that they know that came from Gandhi or from Nehru or from Ambedkar, or that it's something which has been pretty much incorporated into our education system. It's something you learn as a kind of default through school, through university. It's something that you see in your everyday life, in your conversations around the dinner table with the family. So I think most Indians are not ignorant of the national movement or the anti-colonial struggle or partition and independence. I mean, they may not be always very critical, and they may not be, it could be that they just have a kind of simplistic understanding. But many people also have a very sophisticated understanding, and many people also have a lot of questions that they carry around, chance to ask them, until you put something like this book on the table, and then certain kinds of conversations get opened up. But I fear now that if there are drastic changes to our education system, and if textbooks and history books especially are rewritten in radical ways, and certain kinds of histories are just marginalized or silenced, or the emphasis changes in a very drastic way, as it seems to be doing with this kind of trend towards saffronization of syllabi and textbooks and course books and so on. And if those changes are pushed through, without a wide public discussion, as has been happening in, for example, a state like Gujarat, or if you have a very ideologically driven agenda as to what you're teaching young people about India's past, and especially about its recent and modern history, then you can possibly imagine a generation. I mean, I don't think we have such a generation yet, but you can imagine 10, 15 years from now, people have come of age and they don't know anything about the righteous republic. They don't know anything about really the ideals that drove this quest for Swaraj. It could be that they have a completely presentist understanding of India, right? That they only really know the kind of India that has been emerging from the early 90s after Mandal and Mandir and globalization and market reforms, and that would be a shame. I think if such a thing were to come to pass, that entire areas of knowledge in the public consciousness are actively being kind of sidelined or suppressed through government institutions and through government policies, then that's a very dangerous thing. And that's where you have constituencies of educators and writers and people in the media and in academia who have to maintain a vigilance, so that all the different stories, even if they don't hang together, remain memory. Otherwise you end up like, and you see many examples around the world where there have been drastic efforts because of political ideology to forget the past, or to reimagine the past as drastically as you can reimagine the future. So you see that in a place like China, you saw that in the Soviet Union, you see that in places like Iran and so on, right? There's a very problematic relationship to the past, because histories have these contradictions and diversities, and that may not fit in with your current agenda. So India so far, I think, be in touch with itself and with its own diversity and with its own past. It's many histories, but it's now becoming the case that you could imagine a time when there will be a generation very soon, who will not be aware of these things, and that is something to be alarmed about.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just saying that I certainly hope we don't see too much of that happen. For the sake of our children and their children, we hope that their understanding of India and its history and its present, which will be their history, remains intact in a very holistic and generalized manner. But thank you so much, Ananya. I know, like I mentioned in the past when we began the session, that you're taking this on your travels to Istanbul, and thank you for taking time and the trouble to sort of log in from there and share your views on India and it being a righteous republic or not with our viewers. I hope we haven't troubled you too much. And
No, no,
if
it's
there's
been a
anything that
pleasure.
you would like to, leave as a parting note to our viewers at LitFestx.
Well, I mean, it's very exciting that you've come up with this idea of a virtual literary festival. You know, there are so many literary festivals in India and around the world now, but it's not always that people get to go because they may be very far or it may be too expensive or they may not know about it. But I think, you seem to be trying to create a platform that is really open to anyone. And I think that most authors would welcome that. Even if most of us are technologically challenged and digitally backward, the idea that you can reach new audiences in this way is interesting, and I hope it works out for you and for us and for our readers and audiences. So thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Ananya, and great to have you here. All the best.